They really are two particular bodies. So you'll find culturally responsive teaching and you'll find culturally relevant teaching and or pedagogy if you were to look back in kind of educational literature that talks about this. And what I want to say first is that it's really important that you understand that a lot of these things that we're going to talk about within this particular body of work really aren't sitting here in isolation and they've just come up in 2013. But there's been a long history in Canada. These theories come from the States, but there's been a long history in Canada of education that looks at these kinds of issues. At one point it might have been called multicultural education. Multicultural education then became critical multicultural education. There's been a lot of anti-racist education or anti-oppressive education. Sometimes it's under the umbrella of social justice education. So this isn't sitting out there in isolation as something completely brand new. But it is a body of work that actually did come about because it specifically looked at, and all those other bodies didn't necessarily do this. Some did, some didn't. But it specifically looked at educational systems and how, for certain groups of kids, educational systems are not working. And that was nice. I have my own bell tone. And with that, it said, well, what can we do? So specifically, I'm going to hone in on culturally relevant teaching and pedagogy first, because that's where we really connected this work to primarily. And this work comes from a woman named Gloria Ladson Billings, who wrote a book called The Dream Keepers. And it's called The Dream Keepers, Successful Teachers of Black Children. And one of the things that she did was she said, I'm not going to look at the group that's being served. And one of the things that happened is that in the literature about black children and schooling, it was just all basically that they can't learn. There was so much literature in the mid-90s now when she did this. There's so much educational literature that talked about the deficits that this group of kids come with. And she said, well, you know, there's really nothing but racist ideology that informs that thinking. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to look at the group of kids. I'm going to look at teachers who are successful with black students, determined by kids, community, parents, administrators, and I'm going to say, what are these teachers doing, right? Because we know black kids can learn. That's just ridiculous to think that they can't. But what is it that teachers do in those environments where success really is like, whoo, big and out there? And so she went and she studied teachers. Not all black teachers, by the way, also, because that's come up too. Some of the teachers were white. So she looked at white and black teachers, and what she found, and again, we were talking, obviously it doesn't have the level of diversity in the community that, you know, we would have in ours here. But what she found was that these teachers engaged in practices that she coded into three big areas. So they engaged in practices that promoted high academic, and also she talks about behavioral expectations. They engaged in practices that supported something called cultural competence, which I'll talk about as well. And they also engaged in practices that supported this notion of having a critical consciousness, which I'll also give you more information on, okay? In these particular areas, I'm going to talk about things that she found in her research, as well as things that have been discovered in research since her work. So, for example, teachers who've gone out and said, you know what, I'm going to engage in culturally relevant ways. Well, what we're going to share with you is the best of what we know right now. So there's an article that came out in 2008 that talked about, so in these many different classrooms, how have teachers taken this up? So I'm going to share with you those ideas that are going to pop up on the screen that come from that work. So basically in the area of high academic expectations, what that really means is that these were teachers that just didn't give up on students. These were teachers that said, we're in this together, and if you sink, I sink, right? We're all in that ship, and nobody wants that ship to sink. But these teachers really felt invested in the progress of their students. So let me share a little bit more specifically with you what this category entails. So in these classrooms, academic achievement occurred for all students. It doesn't mean every child ends the year at the same place. We have to be honest about that. But that every student in these classrooms makes progress. Teachers go above and beyond what's asked of them. So if I don't know something, if I'm not sure, if these strategies that I know aren't working, I'm going to go and talk to my neighbor teacher. I'm going to go and consult with a specialist in this area. I'm going to go ask someone else. I'm going to find out as much as I can and try as many different things as I can to help students learn. These were also teachers that understood that they had to reach out to community, that maybe you might see a strength in your after-school program that I don't know about. You may know something as the daycare teacher that I need to know that could be helpful for me. So they reached out to other adults who might work with the child in other spaces and places to see, what are you seeing? What do you know? What can I use from what you share that can help me to do better as an educator in this space? These are teachers that would model, scaffold, and differentiate, right? Understanding that every learner comes in with a particular space, looking at themselves and saying, how do I connect to where that learner is? And how do I then provide all of the scaffolding that's needed, right? Sometimes kids will get it from a model. I showed it, go for it, you got it. But these are teachers that said, if that doesn't work, that's not necessarily going to be my first step. I'm going to say, you know what, I do it, then we do it, then you do it. And if you don't get it right when you do it, you know what, my bad, let's do it again. Maybe I partner you, maybe I group you. Maybe I provide you with some additional supports here or there. But these were teachers that tried everything. The other aspect that's really, really important is that these teachers took a view that regardless of whatever is going on in terms of maybe socioeconomic challenges at home or challenges around language or what have you, that you are a capable learner. So they never looked at aspects of social identity like race or class or immigration status or language as a barrier to what your mind can be, right? And oftentimes when we look at the data from schools, we see that particular groups of kids are not doing as well. They didn't look at data that said, well, this group of kids isn't doing as well, and so therefore, you know, they're less capable. They said, you know what, you are capable, and we're going to go above and beyond what limitations might be being set in other places, right? So social identity wasn't a barrier for achievement. In terms of the cultural competence piece, this is the place where kids...
Sorry for the interruption, but Dave, would you please contact me on 501, Dave?
This is the place where teachers said that they never wanted any kids to be ashamed of who they were when they came in their classrooms. So sometimes it meant I'm not going to teach the curriculum that has been given to me about something that is in no way connected to anything you know, anyone you love, anyone from any background that's connected to you at all. I'm going to teach something where you're going to see that you too can be great. You too are included. The people that you love are valued. And so these are teachers that sometimes said, this unit doesn't work. And they might scrap the current curriculum and put in something else. These are teachers that said you need to see yourself and need to see yourself in affirming and positive ways in the classroom. And I might have said it here, I say it a lot, and I'll say it again, and if I did, I apologize for repeat. But Dick Gregory, a famous black activist from the States in the 60s, said he never knew school and never knew shame until he went to school. And so the sort of idea that in any classroom space that kids would walk in, they would never be ashamed of who they are, where they come from, right? So what as teachers can we do to make sure that happens? And it includes some of these things like, we'll talk more about it, but taking an affirming view, making connections, bringing in curriculum that isn't provided necessarily by the school systems you work in. How do we make sure that kids know that they're valued and where they come from is valued and who they are is valued? In the critical consciousness piece, this is the piece that actually the research has found is the hardest piece for teachers to take up. This is the piece we're going to push this year. Yay! And this is the piece that really asks us to critique the common sense, to push back against issues of oppression, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, to push back against power, to think about what it is that's really important in the world and to teach to that. So some of the critical literacy strategies, helping students to read the world, some of the social justice teaching and the actions and advocacy that we can take. For example, the class that wrote to the Prime Minister about the conditions in Attawapiskat. So these teachers engaged in those kinds of things that got kids connected to real issues in real life to help make those connections stronger and more meaningful and help to build a more just world. So those were those kinds of things. I don't want to move on yet because I think it's important that we also talk about where did the culturally responsive piece come in then. So this terminology was actually a part of, and I won't say simultaneous, but another body of work that was out there. And the people were very clear who were doing that work that they were calling theirs culturally responsive. And so what they were looking at was things that were very, very similar. How do we make sure that kids don't leave their identity behind at the door? How do we make this classroom affirming? How do we build home-school connections? And so at the Center for Urban Schooling in 2008, when we started to do this work across schools, we had pieces from both camps of literature that we thought were really important. So I always say we weren't purists. We put those two together and we came to call all of this work culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy because we pull from both. And they both inform the kind of thinking that goes beyond the actions that teachers take.